The rain was relentless that night, cold, unforgiving, as if the sky itself had turned against her. As she stumbled onto the slick pavement, her body trembling, one hand instinctively cradling her swollen belly, while the other reached out into the darkness for someone, anyone, to stop him. But he didn't stop. He didn't even look back. The man she loved, a man who had promised to protect her, had just pushed her into the street like she was nothing, like she was disposable. Before we continue, if you believe in kindness, second chances, and stories that touch the soul, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to the channel. And tell me in the comments, do you think people truly change? Her name was Ilara, and just hours earlier she had still believed in forever. The argument had started like so many others, small, almost meaningless. A missed call, a misunderstood message, the kind of thing couples brushed off every day. But something inside him had shifted. Stress, pride, insecurity, whatever it was, it turned his voice sharp, his eyes cold, and his patience non-existent. The words he hurled at her cut deeper than any blade, accusations she didn't understand, anger she couldn't calm. She tried to explain, tried to reach him, but he had already made up his mind. And then it happened. A shove. A moment of silence, the sound of her body hitting the wet asphalt. Time seemed to freeze as she lay there, stunned, the rain soaking through her dress, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed, growing louder, blending with the pounding of her heart. Her mind couldn't process what had just happened. This wasn't supposed to be her life. This wasn't the man she had married. Across the street, strangers stared. Some hesitated, unsure whether to step in. Others whispered, their faces a mixture of shock and judgment. And her husband, stood there for a brief second, his chest rising and falling, before turning away completely, disappearing into the night, as if leaving her behind was the easiest thing in the world. What he didn't know, what he had never cared enough to ask, was that Ilara wasn't just the quiet, gentle woman he thought he had married. She was the only daughter of a man whose name commanded power in rooms filled with billionaires, a man whose influence stretched across continents. A man who had built an empire so vast that even the wealthiest trembled at the thought of crossing him. But Ilara had never lived like that. She had walked away from it all years ago. Raised in unimaginable luxury, she had grown up surrounded by things that most people could only dream of: private jets, sprawling estates, endless wealth. Yet, in the middle of all that abundance, she had felt something missing: love, simplicity, genuine connection. Her father had loved her, yes, but his world was built on power and control, not warmth, so she left. She chose a different life, a quieter one, a simpler one, and in that life she met him. He was charming in a way that felt real, grounded, different from the men she had known before. He didn't care about money or status, or at least that's what she believed. With him, she felt seen, not as an heiress, not as a legacy, but as herself. She never told him the truth. She wanted to know if someone could love her without knowing what she came from. For a while, it felt like the answer was yes, until the night everything fell apart. The ambulance arrived in a blur of flashing lights and urgent voices. Hands lifted her gently, voices asking questions she could barely answer. All she could think about was the tiny life inside her, the fragile heartbeat she had sworn to protect. At the hospital, the world became a haze of white walls and anxious faces. Doctors moved quickly, their expressions serious but controlled. Minutes stretched into hours, each second filled with unbearable uncertainty. She lay there, clutching the edge of the bed, her heart pounding as she waited for someone to tell her whether her baby was safe. When the doctor finally spoke, relief crashed over her like a wave. The baby was alive. But she wasn't out of danger yet, and neither was her heart. Far away, in a city where glass towers touched the sky, a man sat in silence, staring at a single message on his phone. He had received a call from one of his many private investigators, a man he trusted to keep track of the only thing in his life that truly mattered: his daughter. The words were simple. Too simple for what they meant. She's in the hospital. For a moment, the world's most powerful man felt something he hadn't felt in years. Fear. Within hours, everything changed. Hospitals that once treated her as just another patient suddenly became fortresses of security. Doctors who had been calm now worked with heightened urgency. Staff whispered among themselves, trying to understand why the building was suddenly filled with men in suits. why orders were being given with quiet authority that no one dared question. And then he arrived, her father. He walked through those hospital doors with a presence that silenced everything around him. Not because he demanded it, but because it followed him naturally, the weight of his power, the gravity of his reputation. But beneath all that was something far more human. A father who had almost lost his daughter. When he saw her, lying there pale and exhausted, something inside him broke. The distance between them, the years of silence, the choices she had made, all of it faded in that moment, because nothing mattered more than the fact that she was still breathing. And then he learned what had happened. The room grew colder, the air heavier. The man who had built an empire without mercy suddenly found himself facing something far more personal than business. Someone had hurt his child. Back in the quiet streets where the rain had finally stopped, her husband sat alone, the echoes of his actions beginning to settle in. First, he justified it. Told himself she had pushed him too far, that it wasn't entirely his fault. But as the hours passed, those excuses began to crumble. He replayed the moment over again, the look in her eyes, the way she fell, the silence that followed. Regret crept in slowly, like a shadow he couldn't escape. He reached for his phone, hesitating before calling her. But there was no answer. Only the cold realization that something had gone terribly wrong. By the time he found out where she was, it was already too late. Not because she was gone, but because everything had changed. The hospital he walked into was not the same one he had known. Security stopped him at the entrance, their eyes scanning him with suspicion. His name meant nothing here, his urgency even less. When he finally managed to get inside, what he saw left him frozen. Men in tailored suits lined the hallways. The atmosphere was tense, controlled, almost intimidating. Rayon. And at the center of it all was a presence he couldn't ignore. A man who looked at him not with anger, but with something far worse. Disappointment. That was the moment he understood. He hadn't just hurt his wife. He had shattered something far bigger than himself. Days turned into weeks. Recovery was slow, both physically and emotionally. Ilara remained quiet, her strength returning gradually, but something inside her had shifted. The woman who had once believed in unconditional love now understood its limits. Her father stayed by her side, not as the powerful figure the world feared, but as a man trying to make up for lost time. He didn't push her, didn't demand answers. He simply stayed, and for the first time in years, she let him. As for the man who had pushed her into the street, his world began to unravel in ways he never expected. Opportunities disappeared. Doors that once opened easily now remained closed. Not through revenge, not through force, but through the quiet influence of someone who ensured that actions had consequences. But the greatest punishment wasn't what happened to his career. It was what happened to his heart. Because every day he lived with the memory of the moment he lost everything. And every day he wondered if he would ever get a chance to make it right. Before we reach the end, if this story has touched your heart in any way, please like the video, share it with someone who believes in redemption, and subscribe for more stories that remind us what truly matters. And here's a special request. Comment the word hope if you believe even broken people can find their way back. In the end, Ilara didn't choose revenge. She chose something far more powerful. She chose herself. She chose her child. And she chose a future built not on pain, but on strength. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is walk away and never look back. The first time she stepped outside after weeks in the hospital, the world felt unfamiliar, like a place she once knew but no longer belonged to. The air was warmer now, the rain long gone, yet something inside Ilara still carried the storm. She stood at the edge of the hospital entrance, one hand resting gently on her belly, feeling the quiet, steady reminder that she was no longer alone. Her child had survived. That alone felt like a miracle. But survival came with its own weight, the need to rebuild, to heal, to decide what kind of life she would create from the pieces left behind. Behind her, her father watched silently. He had changed in ways no one else would notice, but she did. The man who once controlled empires now moved carefully around her, as if afraid that one wrong word might break something fragile between them. He didn't try to take control of her choices anymore. He didn't speak of revenge, even though she knew he was capable of it. Instead, he simply offered what he had never truly given before, presence. And slowly she began to accept it. The mansion he brought her to wasn't just a home, it was a world. Vast gardens stretched endlessly, the silence almost too perfect, too controlled. It was everything she had once run away from. Yet this time, it felt different. Not because the place had changed, but because she had. At night, when the world grew quiet, her mind would drift back to him, to the man she had loved. To the moment everything shattered, she didn't hate him. Not in the way people might expect. What she felt was deeper than anger, something heavier, something harder to explain. It was the grief of losing someone who was still alive, the pain of realizing that the person she believed in had never truly existed the way she imagined. But healing doesn't happen all at once. It happens in fragments, a day without tears, a moment of laughter, the courage to wake up and keep going. Meanwhile, far from the life she had returned to, he was living a very different reality. The man who once walked with confidence now carried the weight of every step. His world had shrunk piece by piece until all that remained were the echoes of what he had done. Friends distanced themselves, opportunities disappeared, and the respect he once held faded into something unrecognizable. But none of it compared to the silence where her voice used to be. The silence where her presence once filled every corner of his life. At first, he tried to move on, tried to convince himself that it was over, that he could rebuild just like she had. But no matter how far he ran, he couldn't escape the truth. He had broken something that couldn't be easily fixed. And yet, somewhere deep inside him, a small, stubborn hope refused to die. So he tried. Not in grand gestures or dramatic apologies, but in quiet, consistent ways. He wrote letters he never knew if she would read. He sought help, forcing himself to confront the anger and insecurity that had consumed him that night. He stripped himself of excuses, facing the reality of who he had been and who he needed to become. It was painful. It was slow. But for the first time in his life, it was real. Months passed. The day Elara went into labor, the sky was clear. No storm, no chaos, just a calm, steady stillness, as if the world itself was giving her a second chance. Her father was there, just outside the room, pacing in a way that betrayed the composed image he showed to everyone else. For all his power, all his control, this was something he couldn't command. This was something he could only wait for. And then, finally, a cry. Soft at first, then stronger. Alive. Tears filled his eyes as he stepped inside, seeing his daughter holding her child for the first time. In that moment, everything else faded away. The past, the pain, the mistakes. All that mattered was the tiny life in her arms and the quiet strength in her eyes. She had made it. They both had. Days later, as she sat by the window holding her newborn close, a familiar envelope was placed gently beside her. She didn't need to open it to know who it was from. She had received many like it. At first, she ignored them. Then she read one. Then another. Freddie. Each letter carried the same thing. Not excuses, not justifications, but accountability. He didn't beg. He didn't demand forgiveness. He simply told the truth about his regrets, about the changes he was trying to make, about the man he wished he had been when it mattered most. She didn't respond, but she didn't throw them away either. Because healing isn't about forgetting, it's about understanding. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and fading light, she made a decision, not one driven by emotion, but by clarity. She agreed to see him. The meeting was simple. No dramatic setting, no grand moment, just two people sitting across from each other, separated by everything that had happened and everything that could never be undone. He looked different. Not just physically, but in a way that was harder to describe. There was no arrogance in his posture, no defensiveness in his eyes, just a quiet, steady humility. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, because some silences say more than words ever could. When he finally looked at her, there was something raw in his expression. Not desperation, not expectation, but acceptance of whatever she chose, even if it meant losing her forever. And in that moment, she saw it. Not the man he used to be, but the man he was trying to become. Forgiveness is complicated. It's not a single moment or a simple choice. It's a process, a journey that requires strength, patience, and a willingness to let go, not of what happened, but of the hold it has over you. She didn't take him back, not in the way he might have once hoped, But she didn't close the door completely either. Because sometimes second chances don't look like going back. Sometimes they look like moving forward differently. Co-parenting, respect, boundaries, growth. A new kind of relationship built not on what they once had, but on what they could responsibly create for the child who now connected them forever. And that was enough, because in the end, this was never just a story about heartbreak. It was a story about choices. About the consequences we face and the strength it takes to rise from them. About the kind of love that doesn't destroy you, but teaches you who you need to become. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something real, don't just scroll away. Like this video, share it with someone who needs a reminder that healing is possible, and subscribe for more stories that stay with you long after they end. Because sometimes the most powerful endings aren't about getting everything back. They're about becoming someone stronger than you ever were before.